Good morning. Turning your Bibles to Genesis chapter 15. Go ahead. I'll wait on you. There'll be a test at the end. I think the bulletin even says it's on page 20, if you're not good with chapters and whatnot. All right, Genesis 15. Listen to the word of the Lord. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He said, "Don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield, your very great reward." But Abram said, "O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "You've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." And then the word of the Lord came to him and said, "This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir." And he took him outside and said, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." And he said, "So shall your offspring be." And so Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And he also said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it." But Abraham said, "O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I'll gain possession of it?" And the Lord said, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." And Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. And then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they'll be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I'll punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. And in the fourth generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." And when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, Jebusites, all the sides." You have probably figured it out by now that I am not Pastor Tim. If you came in late, I'm not Pastor Tim. My name's Nathan Lane. I am a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University. I teach Old Testament and Hebrew. And it's my pleasure to be with you today. Let me, a little bit about me. I'm married. I have 3 kids, 11, 8, and 5. And I guess we moved to South Florida about 9 years ago. We love it here. I don't know if there's anyone actually from South Florida, but we moved here and couldn't be happier. A little tidbit about me, my wife and I, we are small group junkies. Every place that we go, whenever we've had to move several times for school and jobs, and every time we move, our first goal is to find a church that we like, where God's calling us to, and then our second goal is to find a small group in that church where we can get connected. We have found that sitting knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder with people in a circle is a lot more conducive to finding connection. And we've had some great groups, and we got friends all over the place. Our last group is maybe the most interesting. Usually when you have small groups, like Pastor Mark was saying, this men's discipleship group, most times small groups are folks that kind of all look the same and are about the same. Men, women, young families, young singles, older folks, all of that. Our last group had about 9 families, something like that. And it went from, we had a couple in their 20s who were engaged, all the way up to a couple in their 80s who had been married 50 years. And we had everything in between. We had folks like me in their 30s with smaller kids, and we had folks that were in their 40s and 50s whose kids were graduating college. and it was just the spectrum. And it was just incredible. One of my favorite parts of the group was the 86-year-old. His name was Ralph, and Ralph had lived and is still living a very full life. And as you could imagine, with an 86-year-old guy, he had lots of great stories. And I think that most of them were probably even true. So one of the ways that I used to like to start that small group is we would have what we call story time with Uncle Ralph. And Ralph would give us like a little 5-minute snippet of his life. And he would say, okay, here's where we are. You know, this is happening and this is happening. And he's just a masterful storyteller. In fact, oftentimes he would be kind of at the end of the story and he would be, that's done. And then and I'd say, all right, it's time for our study. And everyone's like, no, we just want more stories from Ralph. So one of the things I really liked, though, was all the stuff that Ralph had to teach us. And I got my brain thinking, what if in a small group you could have some of these folks from the Bible come in and sit knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder with you? What if Abraham and Sarah showed up one day, or Jacob, or Moses, or David, or Solomon, or Mary Magdalene, or Paul, or Peter? And what would they say? How would they encourage you? How would they say, look, this is how God's working in your life? What would they say is like, man, this is a mistake I made, and you don't need to make that mistake? I found that's one of the great things about some of my older friends is the best advice they give me is what not to do, right? And they say, hey, don't do that. This is a place I just royally mess things up, and you don't need to do that. So what are some places they would see God working, and some cautions they would give, and where would they affirm me and give me hope and things like that? And so today I want to imagine that we're in a group with Abraham. And what if Abraham was in our small group and we're sitting around knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder, and Abraham got to talk to us for a bit? It would be fun. Because you see, not very many people in the Bible had a life with God as active in it as Abraham. You'll remember that the story of Scripture is that God created the world good, and then we fouled it up, right? We started sinning, and then things got pretty bad pretty quickly. And by the end of Genesis 11, things were really bad. And so in Genesis 12, God calls this guy Abraham, who's 75, and his wife Sarah, who's 65, and he calls them to begin the plan of redemption through this old couple. They don't have any kids, and he says, I'm going to make you two barren folks into a great nation, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to give you a land. You have to go to it. And so Abraham, in a time when he should be comfortable and he should be relaxing and he should be kind of resting on the work of his life. I mean, I hope that when I'm 75, I'm kind of done and I'm spending most of my days playing tennis or hanging out with friends or whatever we just want to do. I don't think at 75 I want to embark into a new country that I've never been to and none of my family lives in. But Abraham went and did what God said. And so that kind of is the beginning of Abraham's story. Where we picked up today in Genesis 15 is a little later. In fact, Genesis 15 verse 1 says, after this. This is one of the things that the Bible does, is that it gives these little, like, after this. And after what? Well, a whole stinking decade has passed, right? It's a long time, and the Bible just blows through it really quickly with after this. What's happened in this decade? Abraham's had a lot happen. He's almost gotten killed in Egypt because he sold Sarah off as his sister, and I think he would say, hey, that's a bad idea. Probably telling the truth is better than telling a half lie. And then he had to go and rescue his nephew Lot, and he defeated 5 kings with the help of the Lord. Stuff's been happening. But 10 years has passed, right? And if you're 75 and your wife's 65 and you've never had any kids, and God says you're going to have kids, you would probably imagine this is going to happen soon, right? In my mind, that would be a quick thing. And so you could imagine after 10 years, Abraham's starting to think, hey, what's going on? Why are we waiting still? Where's God at? And so what's God's first words to Abraham after this, right? He comes to him in a vision, and what does he say? He says, fear not. Well, why? Don't be afraid. Why would Abraham have been afraid? Well, because years and years had passed. Because Abraham probably had thought, man, maybe I misheard that promise of God. Maybe that stuff that happened 10 years ago didn't really happen. You start to question yourself, and you start to think maybe the promises of God aren't as true as the things that the world is telling you. And you start to think, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I just had some pizza too late at night, and then it was just a bad dream. And after 10 years, all those things would go through your mind. And you're worried, what's going to happen? And so what does God say? He says, fear not, I'm here, right? And then what's God's very next thing? I'm your shield. I'm your very great reward. What does God do? He turns the promise back to him. Right? I think one of the things that Abraham would tell us is that one of the ways that we foul things up is when we start looking to our own self to bring God's promises and God's kingdom to fruition. If we think, I know how to build God's kingdom, that's the first step down the wrong path. And I think what Abraham would tell us if we're sitting knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder, I think he would tell us, hey, I'm really bad at taking that first step down the wrong path. In fact, even in our story right here, he takes a step down the wrong path and he says, yeah, hey, Lord, I know I got Eliezer. He's going to be my servant. He's going to get my inheritance. That's not a crazy thing. It's a pretty normal thing. In fact, if in those days, if you were an older couple and you didn't have someone to inherit your land, you would take your most trustworthy servant and you would give them all that you had. And you would kind of adopt them into your family, and they'd get your stuff. I don't know if any of you work for any really rich folks, but that would be a pretty good deal, huh? So Abraham's telling God, hey, I got this. I think what I'm going to have to do is make Eliezer my heir, right? That's probably what you meant. And I think one of the things that Abraham would tell us is that he's really good at trying to think of ways to help God along the way. We're going to even see, even after this crazy stuff that happens in Genesis 15, in the next chapter, Abraham does the same thing. They still don't have a kid, and what's he do? Him and Sarah say, well, maybe it's not both of us that are meant to have a kid. Maybe it's just you, Abraham. So why don't you have a kid with Hagar, the maidservant, and that'll be the child of promise. Again, they're taking a step. They're working it out in their own way. They're taking a step down their own path. And later on, Abraham pulls the same kind of shenanigans with this king named Abimelech that he pulled with Pharaoh, where he thought, God's not going to protect me, so I better sell Sarah off. And so we see this over and over and over again. Abraham's hard-headed. He would say, man, it took me a long time to learn this. It took me a long time to learn to trust the Lord. In fact, I think that would be Abraham's number one thing to us. You know what? I don't think he ever really learned to trust the Lord until the binding of Isaac, right? Later on, you know the story. Abraham and Sarah do eventually have a kid. They name him Isaac. And then whenever Isaac's probably a young teen or so, God comes to him one day and says, hey, I want you to take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac. I want you to sacrifice him. And then Abraham is obedient that time. And then you know that story that God keeps him from sacrificing his son. But the rabbis have this interesting theory, right? And it's probably just a theory. But they think that maybe even that story with Abraham and Isaac is only one side of the conversation. They think that maybe God said, I want you to take your son. And Abraham said, well, I've got 2 sons. And then God said, I want you to take your only son. And Abraham said, well, this is the only son of his mother. Ishmael's the only son of his mother, and Isaac's the only son of his mother. And then God said, I want you to take the one that you love. And Abraham said, well, I love them both. And so then finally God had to say, Isaac, I want you to take Isaac. You know what I'm doing here. And it wasn't until that point, I think, whenever Abraham, and in that story, fully learned to trust that God's ways aren't our ways, that he does things different. and that we can't start immediately taking it into our own hands, right? So back to Genesis 15, he says, I got Eliezer. I can just leave him my inheritance. In verse 4, but then the word said, no, this man's not going to be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. And he took him out to the stars and he said, look, if you can count the stars, that's how many children you'll have. And then in verse 7, he said, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to take possession of it. And so what we see in this next verse is that God is reminding Abraham. I think Abraham would say sometimes whenever the going gets tough and you're forgetting the promises of the Lord, I think what Abraham would say is that sometimes you got to remind yourself, and you need God to remind you of God's history with you in the past, right? That there are times in your life when things get really hard, and the only way that you're going to keep going and keep moving towards what God's calling you to is to remember how God's been faithful to you in the past. If you ever watch these financial commercials where it's like, you should invest in this mutual fund, it's returned 75% for the last 10 years, and you think, wow, this is the greatest thing ever. Only an idiot wouldn't put his money in this. Everyone should put their money in it. And then there's this little tagline at the end that says, past performance is not an indicator of future results. Have you ever seen that on those commercials? And that's them just saying, hey, it ain't going to happen again. So don't, just buyer beware. But I think that Scripture tells us, though, the opposite of that. That with the Lord, God's past performance is an indicator of future results. That whenever things get tough, what you have to do is remind yourself of how God has been faithful in the past to get you through the next thing. And in Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy is this big, long sermon that Moses gives the Israelites before they're about to go into the Promised Land. Can you imagine this? Moses, 120 years old, he gives a 32-chapter sermon in one day as they're getting ready to go in. Snooze fest, huh? So, the first 4 chapters, though, you got to think if you're going to give sermon to folks and get them ready to go in, what would you do? The first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy are a rehearsal of all the ways that God's been faithful in the past. And Moses said, you remember this, and you remember this, and you remember this, and you remember this. And the people would say, we remember. And now Moses is saying that now we're going to go. And if God's done all those things, God's going to do this thing. And so God reminds them, I'm the one who brought you up. I'm the one who brought you up. And then this weird story gets tucked into Genesis 15. It's weird. And so even Abraham's still hard-headed in verse 8. He says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I'll gain possession of it? So God says, all right, this is what we're going to do. And the Lord said, bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. And then Abram brought him all these, and they cut them in 2 and arranged the halves opposite each other. In the ancient world, this is the way you would make a contract. And this is the way you would let folks know that you intend to do what you say you're going to do. And so this is kind of a gory thing to talk about right before you're about to go have lunch, or you just loaded up on donuts beforehand. But you would have these animal carcasses lined up, and then you would walk through those animal carcasses. Both parties would walk through the animal carcasses. And the idea was, if I don't keep my end of the contract, then whatever happened to those animals, may that happen to me. In fact, in Hebrew, the Hebrew word, you don't make a covenant and you don't write a covenant, you actually cut a covenant. The verb is to cut, because it's associated with these cutting of the animals. And so God speaks to Abraham right kind of where he's at and says, hey, I'll let you know. I'll speak your language. And how good is it that God speaks to us where we're at and in ways that we can hear. And so Abraham gets them all set. And then God says, you're going to do, these things are going to happen. Verse 13, but know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the country, not their own, and then they'll be enslaved and mistreated. And that's just God reminding Abraham that, hey, I'm calling you to stuff, but it's not easy stuff. It only happens on TV preachers and in books that people buy and aren't true, that God calls you to things that are easy and are going to make you crazily wealthy and rich, and your life's going to be better in every way imaginable. God's not calling you to win the lotto. God is calling you to be holy and to live a holy life and to live a life of difference that makes a change in the world. And if you live differently, your life's going to go differently, and it's going to be hard. And so God reminds Abraham, hey, it's going to be hard. And I think if Abraham were sitting in the circle with us, I think he'd tell us that too. He'd say, you're not going to believe this happened and this happened. And just think, we only have 2 or 3 decades of Abraham's life, just the high points in these 12 chapters or so that are about Abraham. Imagine all the stuff that didn't get put in. Imagine all the hard times and all the struggles and things that weren't in Scripture. Right? And God's saying there's going to be bad times, but I'm going to be with you. And then the final little section, the final section of Genesis 15 is like it's like a weird twist. It's like a movie where you find out at the end that Darth Vader's really Luke's father, or that the I see dead people thing. Remember, I don't know if you guys have seen that, the Sixth Sense movie. That's too old now. No one's probably ever seen that. So that's the word. As I get older, all the my good illustrations for college students make no sense to them anymore. I'm like, it's like this, it's like Seinfeld, and they're like, what's Seinfeld? I'm like, man, you kids. It stinks not being hip anymore. It stinks never having been hip. So at any rate, this is like the movie that has the twist at the end. Because the twist at the end is in verse 17, and it says, and when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. It's pretty widely, generally held that the smoking firepot and the blazing torch represents the Lord. And you'll remember that later on in the Exodus, the cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, those represent the Lord, and this probably does too. And so the Lord is the one who goes between the carcasses, not Abraham. Abraham's sleeping over on the side. And it's the Lord who goes through. And it's the Lord who says, I got this. It's the Lord who says, you can trust me. You can trust me. If I don't do the things I said, may this stuff happen to me. You can trust me. And in the loudest possible way, and in the language that Abraham spoke, God said, you can trust me. You can trust me. And I think Abraham would tell us in our little small group, he would say that there's going to be times in your life when you're going to have to remember that God's saying, you can trust me. And I think what Abraham would say is that when God says, you can trust me, things are going to go different. That God's not going to say, you can trust me, and then it goes exactly like you think. That God's going to say, you can trust me, and then you don't know which way the road's going to go. But you know He's going to be with you. And as I look back on my own life, there's just been just multiple times where I look back and I've seen God just saying, I got this. But it doesn't work out like you would expect. I was telling the earlier service, I don't know how to tell stories about my family without making my family. I'm always worried my mom's going to find out about these stories and then call and say, hey, listen, why would you tell that story? I would say, why would we live that story? So I have a great family, but I come from really rural South Georgia. My dad's a commercial fisherman. My mom cleaned houses. No one in my family had ever been to college. And so I thought I was going to always grow up, work on my dad's shrimp boat, and then maybe get to be a youth pastor at our church. And some weird stuff happened, and I got a scholarship to go to this school in Tennessee for a year. I got a 1-year scholarship. So I thought, I'm going to go up for a year and learn whatever I can learn, and then I'm going to come home and work on my dad's boat and be a youth pastor. And as God would have it, whenever I got to college, He said, hey, that's not what's going to happen. And that 1 year turned into 12, and a college degree turned into a PhD, and crazy stuff happened along the way. But I never would have imagined that 1 year was going to be like it turned out to be. And life diverges. It doesn't go like you think, and God's saying you can trust me. The loudest time we've ever heard that is whenever we were in our late 20s. My wife and I decided we were ready to start a family. And pretty quickly, as we were starting a family, we recognized that we were really bad at having kids the old-fashioned way. Not just really bad, we're horrible at it. We've never even been kind of pregnant. And so we felt that God was saying, hey, we want you to adopt. And we want you to adopt whoever we send. And so that sounds like a great idea, except like I said, I'm a guy from rural South Georgia. And my wife is from, the Midwest. She's from Oklahoma. We're the two whitest people you will ever meet. I mean, look at me. And so now I have, our kids are all various shades of brown. And if you had told me, like, this is the way your family's going to work out, I would have said, that's the craziest thing you've ever said. But I got a 8-year-old Haitian son that's tracking to be like 6'4", and I got a 5-year-old Guatemalan daughter that's going to be like 5 foot. We're going to have the weirdest Christmas picture ever. And I mean, even we do now, right? I mean, it's just, our family's weird. And every time I look at them, and every time I see the pictures, it's just a reminder of God saying, you can trust me. You can trust me. I'm going to work this out. It's going to be better than you think. I mean, if you had told me, 12 years ago, you're going to have a family that looks like this, and it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to you, I would say, you're thinking about someone else. I'm from Brunswick, Georgia. That's not how we do it. And God's saying, no, you can trust me. I got this. Of course, the loudest you can trust me ever is the gospel, right? The good news is that Christ became a human and dwelt among us and then died and was resurrected. And that's God's super loud affirmation, you can trust me. I got this. That is God walking through the carcasses saying, I'm going to redeem you. You can trust my promises. And even as a church, we wait for the last you can trust me, right? The last you can trust me will be Christ's return and gathering of his body to himself. The loud you can trust me. And so I would encourage you today, right, to think, what would Abraham tell us, right? What would Abraham tell us if he's sitting around and we're all in the group? How would he encourage us? And I think there's some of you here that God has made promises to, and those promises seem really far in the rearview mirror at this point. So far that you're questioning them and thinking, maybe not. And I think God would say, fear not. It's about me. I am your reward. I'm your shield. I got this. You can trust me. And so I think they're going to come and play. And lead us in one final song.